right, welcome. Jumping back in today real quick. Want to talk about CPI. The last time I talked about CPI, I think, was in December. If you haven't watched that video, that is on YouTube. I'll go over some of that today, and we'll go over some of the data we've collected in the last couple months and where we're headed into next season. Start off with a quote. It's actually the same quote I used last time. I thought it was just, quite fitting for CPI. So that quote is, what gets measured gets improved. And that's certainly the case here with CPI. The more bag tracker rounds we get, the more data we get on players, the stronger CPI gets and the more of a tool it becomes for all of us. And we'll talk about that. All right, topics today. We're going to go over once again, how CPI is calculated. We'll look at where you can find CPI. These are both topics I've covered before. We will look at some updated data on CPI, kind of comparing it to where it was in December, last time I talked about it, to today. And we will also discuss some of the long-term plans that we've been talking about behind the scenes and looking for some input from directors on where we go with the data going forward. And then we'll finish with a quick Q&A. Okay, if you have comments throughout, I don't mind showing those. Daryl gave a little quick what's up. And I can share those throughout. If you have questions at the end, feel free to chime in with those. All right, quick recap. This is on our website. It's actually found in the player app as well. Just to get a quick recap for you. CPI is calculated on a scale of 1 to 12. That would be 1 is the lowest, 12 is the highest. Certainly to this point, we've never had anybody at a 12. And I actually heard today, coming out of this past weekend, Jamie Graham is a 10.96. I believe that's the highest CPI we have seen since we started collecting data. So this is a unique rating system. We're combining a player's PPR, player's DPR for the current season and including their previous 2 seasons. So this is a pretty lengthy set of data. On top of PPR and DPR, we are also collecting data on career weighted win-loss record. Now, when I say weighted, that would mean, winning or losing at a local blind draw or local event is weighted much lighter than if you were to win or lose at a regional event, and so forth with the state level event, interstate, and an ACL Open. And then the highest level being the ACL National, which would be those pro brackets. So I think that's the best thing about CPI is that it's weighted. So going, losing a game at a local blind draw will not hurt your CPI near as much as losing to someone with a lower CPI than you at, say, an open event. So, playing a lot of local events really just builds the strength of your CPI. It's not designed to, fluctuate at the local event compared to larger events. Okay, some places I touched on before where you can find CPI as a director and, as a player. So as the director, when you enter players into an event, you can see their PPR and their CPI inside that event. That's listed right with their name, okay? If you just do the simple player search in the admin portal, you can see their PPR and CPI right there. And then on the player side, I have this little graphic up here. This is what this looks like currently in the current version of the player app. So a few quick ways you can find a player's CPI. The other way, which is newer in the last few months, if you go to the director dashboard in the admin portal, click on that. You can then click on the bag tracker data sheet. All directors have access to this sheet. And now this sheet also shows CPI. So if players, are kind of asking, or if you're curious on your end, I know Dustin did one of these sessions, Dustin Arnold out of New York, a while back, and he also included that bag tracker data sheet. It provides a ton of good information, and CPI is one of those. Okay. Just want to point back to a session I did back in December on CPI. This session in December was called CPI, How Does It Work? And I kind of went in depth on how it's working at that time, what we were building up behind the scenes with CPI, and we looked at a couple different player examples. If you haven't watched that or any of our director sessions, I mentioned the one Dustin just did, you know, Chris, Ashley, Chad, Athena. We've all kind of jumped in and done director sessions. They're all stored on YouTube. So search for the ACL events YouTube page. That's different than the ACL main YouTube page. This is specific to directors. You can find sessions that I've done, other directors have done. One of those is CPI. So take advantage of that. Okay. Moving right on through, just want to kind of update some data here. When I did that session in December, we were just under 23,000 players, I think, that had a CPI. And now you can see today, when we pull the data, we are at, just about 25,000 players. So just in the last couple of months, we've added, a couple thousand players to the pool of CPI. So that's just a testament to you directors running events, having that data and the bag tracker data pulled in allows us to build a stronger CPI. So, just a reminder to you guys, when you are running those events, pulling that data is super important to us, and we're all going to be able to benefit from that data, kind of go forward. And as we're looking towards that new technology, the new way we might use CPI. So just run through, you can see at the top level there, a 10 plus CPI. Prior to pulling this data here, the previous data in December, we've added one player at above 10. And so I'm sure some players have dropped, some players have rose up, one player at the top. But if you look in the middle, that's really where the player base is at. Players who have a CPI between a 6 and a 7, that's 33% of the current player base. And we added 668 players to that number in just the last couple months. So you can really see by looking at this data here, kind of that group between a 5 CPI and a 7 CPI. I mean, that's really 64, 65% of our player base. A lot of people are sitting in that. If we think back, we're taking PPR, DPR for the current season and the previous two. We're taking a player's win-loss for their career. And that is getting majority of our players in that 5 to 7 range, which I think is really important to know. I have some data coming up here on the next slide where we talk about current skill levels versus current CPI numbers. We can dive into that. And if you go back to that other one I did a couple months ago, I took some real specific examples of players in this range and how they might compare to each other. But I think it's pretty important to see that even down the 4.0 to 5 range, we're still at 12% there, but we're adding a lot of players to that one particularly as well. So we'll keep tracking this data. I'm going to keep sharing this as much as I can with you guys. I think it's fun stuff, but it's really cool to see where we're adding our players as you continue to run your events. So stick with those events. Got a comment coming in from Kevin. I appreciate you, Kevin. I always enjoy our conversations. Yeah, I agree. Like within these ranges, I like seeing where those players are fitting and kind of how they're moving. To me, it really feels like that 5.0 to that 7 point is just where the majority of our players are at. The players we're seeing at the local level, I can imagine a player throwing like a 6.5 PPR and then coming in at like a low 5 CPI. And so this is really the range where majority of our players are at. All right. Just wanted to touch on some of the longer term plans. We've been talking about CPI internally a lot lately. I got some other things to share with you in this and a lot of things coming up in the next month and into June, specifically around CPI. What we want to do is we want to create skill levels based on the data that we have captured. For the last few years, we've been using, advanced, competitive, intermediate, and novice, and they have their spot in cornhole. They've worked for us. We've been able to, utilize those, but I think it's just not fitting everywhere. Everywhere in the country is different from itself. You might be competitive in one state and go to an open, and you're not competitive. And so we want to use CPI to kind of develop more of a seamless skill based. And so we want to get away from advanced. We want to get away from competitive intermediate at the local and at the regional level, and we want to start using CPI. And so as we release some tools here in the next couple months, we'll be looking for feedback from directors. The other big idea coming out is CPI registration limits. With CPI being a pretty accurate tool, we're finding, I'm really interested in how that might work for directors. And then, of course, a lot more ideas on the table, and we want to hear ideas from directors as well. So we'll be doing that a lot over the next couple months. Got Mountain Town Cornhole chiming in here. Good stuff. Yep, I completely agree. Collecting this data has been powerful, and I'm excited. Another comment here. Oh, got a couple of them. Sorry. How does it work if someone doesn't have a CPI? That's a big discussion that we're currently having. Right now, kind of behind the scenes, if a player does not have a CPI or an ACL account and they just create one, behind the scenes, they're going to be kind of starting at that 5 level, and this would be quickly changing based on the CPI or based on the PPR and DPR they throw early on, and then based on the wins losses. So we're still definitely talking about and want to talk with directors on how we can get new players with no CPI fitting into these levels. So no solid answer right now, but we're working towards it. It takes a lot more of a tennis ranking format. Yeah, I agree. I think, the direction that the ACL is kind of heading is we do like the model that tennis uses, even at the professional and amateur level. And, CPI is built a lot around the chess ranking, and, it uses kind of a similar metric with tennis as well. So we're trying to pull a lot of data in from other sports and make that fit our sport. Okay, and then we have another comment here. Yep, I think matchmaking versus divisions is going to be ideal as well. Like I talked about in December, really curious about that advanced player that has a 6.5 CPI. What happens when they play that competitive player who also has a 6.5 CPI? And finding out how CPI interacts in those cases is going to be really important for us. All right, now looking at current ACL skill levels. Now remember, this is just what a player has in their account, which is always tough for us, right? Player might have competitive in their account or advanced in their account. They may not truly be at that level, but that's what their account is showing. So this data is pulling not from where players are playing, but actually from what their account says they are. So, top to bottom here, the numbers kind of fall in line a little bit. The average ACL Pro has a 9.06 CPI. As you go down the line, you see the Pro Junior. The average elite player I find interesting has a 7.73. Now that does make sense to me because I think we found there's quite a few advanced players that went elite this season. They want to be a junior pro, a female pro, a senior pro, or they want to go ACL pro, and they just haven't reached that CPI yet. So interesting to see that CPI is actually lower than all of the pro divisions for elite. I found that quite interesting. The average advanced player right now, 7.23. I was going to say something funny. I kind of forgot about that. What was it? Dustin from Florida said he may be the lowest CPI advanced player in the country. I forget what CPI. I think it was in the 5s, if I don't remember right. Dustin. But, we were kind of making a joke that he might be the lowest CPI advanced player in the country. Maybe time to move his account down. We have, the average competitive player, 6.25, intermediate, 5.4, and novice. Now, I would like to see how these start changing as players' skill levels continue to adjust and get more accurate to where they belong. But using this as a baseline is interesting. Yeah, and so Mountain Town says this must be a quick form to kind of equate what a newer player CPI would be. Yeah, I completely agree. I think that would happen quickly, and I'd like to get a tool out to directors where if you do have a new player and maybe they're using other software and they could say, hey, this is my PPR over here, where should I go? And maybe we could quickly like input some data and give them, like you said, a CPI-ish number, somewhere to go with that. All right, next one. Now, as we're thinking about tiers, I think it's really important to look at two different levels. We need to have what maybe is this national tier, and that's got to be completely different than what we're using locally and regionally. So let's start nationally. I think keeping numbers simple is better. So when I look at this data and I broke this out, I think starting, in these type of ranges keeps it simple and easy to understand. So 8.0 to a 12, these players are only 4% of our player base. So to me, we're looking at 8.0 to 12 as being that tier 1 nationally. Now wait till we get to the next slide. We'll talk about locally. But nationally, 4% of our players being in that tier 1, I think kind of makes sense. These would be your pros and your elite and your higher advanced players, right? We saw some of those elite players average a 7.73, so it'd be interesting to see as some of them dropped out, do they all meet that 8 range? Tier 2, this is where those players that are winning, I'm assuming winning regionals and playing well at home, that's 14% of our player base. These are the players that are probably traveling to state tournaments, not just your local player on a weeknight, but getting that 7 CPI to 7.9, we're going to find about 14% there. Now the next two nationally, I think, again, keeping it simple, 6 to 6.99, right? It's just one. If you're in a 6, you're in tier 3 nationally. And this is where the biggest group for us would be tier 3 and tier 4. So this data is going to change, but I'd like to kind of keep the national number simple. And 5 tiers to me kind of makes sense. Interested to hear you guys' feedback on that. And I want to kind of set up some conversations around the stuff that we can all work together on. But just breaking it down today, kind of went through this. Now next, if we were going to go to some local regional tiers, I think we'd have to make some adjustments because everywhere is different. Even locally for me, I may only have 1 or 2 players locally that have an 8 CPI. Maybe I don't have any. So having a tier 1 locally 8.0 to 12 might not make any sense. So locally, I think splitting into 5 doesn't necessarily help. Where we may need to look at like a 6.5 to 12, knowing that we may only have only 1 player that's 8 to 12, right? So we're really targeting that 6.5 to 8 player locally as a tier 1 type player in the local format, the local circuit, and the regional. Keeping 30, around 30% of our players regionally in this would maybe help. So that way it's not 10% of players playing open, 15% playing advanced, 40% playing competitive, right? We want to find the magic number here. What I find interesting is this 5.5 to 6.5 seems like a small range, but we already learned like that's where most of our players are at. And so if we were to split a regional event into 3 tiers, most of those players are actually going to be 5.5 to 6.5. Yeah, couple comments here flying in. Player versus director hat. This is important that we're doing. A lot of directors are players, and so thinking about that. Never finishing better than 13th at intermediate regional. How's that going to help me? Yeah, and so that's where I think going to this level here, I would be curious to know what your CPI is and does that fit in what I think is a tier 3 only based on the data. But I really like that you want to point out, player versus director hat. That's super important. A lot of us think like players, A lot of us think like directors, and we got to kind of find what makes sense for our players and not only using just the data. So thanks for that one. And this next one, I completely agree. 6 to 12 is a huge chunk, but I also agree that it might be necessary. Now, again, areas are going to be different. In my area, if I run a regional, I might only have one player that's 8.1, and now actually this tier 1 is fitting where a lot of those 6.5 players who we might have marked as competitive or advanced right now would be in that upper group. So that's kind of where I'm leaning with that. And Kevin chimes back in here. He's not sure he agrees locally, which is great because I want to have conversations to find out where we can agree. He says the variability of a top player is too high, and we lose the players that never feel like they have a shot. And I completely agree with that. We are losing players that feel like they don't have a shot. And so, this data could be completely off. And that's kind of where I go into one of these next slides here, because this is still using national data that I'm trying to break to a local level. Okay. What we're talking about with CPI and event registrations kind of, might lean towards what Kevin is saying here is giving directors actually a CPI flexibility when registering for an event, whether, that's a regional or a local event. Allowing directors to come up with custom CPI ranges for their events. And another one that I find that I would probably want to try out is this average CPI. And so this idea came about recently. I think it's kind of strange, but I also am really interested in try it. What if I was going to run like a large event and I just had players sign up? They're not signing up tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3. They're just simply signing up for that event. Now, on the day of the event, I would then pull everybody's CPI through the admin, and then I would split them into tiers simply based on who is registered, maybe taking an average number. I'm not sure that this is a problem solver for us, but I'm just interested in testing it out. But I think custom CPI ranges can be very helpful. Kevin, if you're finding, up in your area, you're like, hey, a 6.7 to a 7.5 is a great group. Let me try that this week. Let me try that this month, and giving some flexibility, but getting away from, telling players, hey, if you throw 5 PPR, you're intermediate, or if you throw, 6.5 PPR, you're competitive. But the CPI is actually taking win-loss into account, which I think is really important. So you might throw a 6.5 CPI, but lose all the time. So or 6.5 PPR, but lose all the time. And so your CPI is actually going to be lower. And so, just kind of giving that flexibility and allowing our directors kind of going into the summer and into next season to have some power there around that number. And that kind of brings me into one of the next slides here. CPI in its current form, it's not going to work, right? I believe creating a dynamic number out of CPI is going to be super powerful for all of you guys. We're doing that behind the scenes. A couple slides here, I'll talk about some of the dynamics we've been putting in that number in the background. But to have a CPI is one thing. A player might look and be like, oh, I'm a 6.2, but they really have no idea what that means. Like, what is a 6.2, right? They need to see their CPI versus everybody in their club, right? Have a CPI club standings, have a CPI state standings, CPI using AI models, which we've been talking about a lot lately. Can CPI actually predict a win and a loss in a bracket or a particular matchup? Or, what can AI bring into the CPI for us, which we've been using behind the scenes a lot or talking about a lot? And then CPI graphs. Like, I think this is important for the average player, kind of see where they were 3 weeks ago, where they were, a couple months ago, and kind of the trend of their CPI. So making CPI a dynamic number is the next steps for us as we head into summer and get ready for, the new technologies coming out next season. Going back to that last slide, Daryl says average CPI. Yeah, I think it's interesting. I'm not sure, Daryl, if it solves any problems, but I'm interested to at least test it out and see what it does. Kevin says we'll have access to some of the data Yeah, I think Kevin, we're gonna have access to a lot of this. Obviously, I have some of it on a sheet. I'm willing to share any data with you, Kevin, that you're interested, or any directors. But we will have actually this data in dynamic form for everybody as the technology continues to improve. Yep, and I agree. As we get dynamic with the number, then these ideas become more real. Right now, I've been talking about CPI a lot this whole season, and that number is still the same number to the players. Not dynamic yet, but we will get it there. I promise we're talking about it. We have a lot of conversations about it. Daryl, yeah, throwing 6.5 and losing all the time. Hey, I know all about it. Losing is my thing. I think in the director's blind draw at Worlds, I've played in 3 of them, and I'm 0-6. So I've never won a game in the director's blind draw at Worlds. I like losing. All right. Something I wanted to point out that we've also been doing behind the scenes, and now this is at the pro level where right now we have a ton of data, right? And being able to use AI and other tools to bring this down to the local level is important. But we did some CPI bracket predictions for the last 2 pro nationals. We simulated the bracket results 50,000 times in the simulator, and it spit out who it thinks will place top 4 in every bracket over 50,000 simulations, only using CPI as the metric. So we can see at pro signature number 2 in Mesa, it actually predicted 10 of the 16 players that finished top 4 in their bracket. It predicted that. And so there's some outliers there, right? I think Colby Shearer was predicted in that bracket by CPI to finish like 14th or 19th, and he won his bracket. And we all know cornhole, is all about outliers, right? You can win any game, so that's definitely going to happen. But seeing that CPI is at least on the right track, I thought was pretty cool. And then again, bang, signature number 3 in Colorado predicted 10 of the 16 players that finished top 4 in their bracket. 2 brackets it actually predicted, or 1 bracket it predicted first and second accurately, and 2 of them it predicted first place right out of the gate. Now we also did this for doubles. That takes into account both players' CPI. I don't have that data on the screen here in front of me, but it was actually pretty darn accurate. One thing to point out, as we're on the pro thing real quick, at Signature 3 in Colorado, I know Russ Brown was there, Chris was there, Athena. It was actually quite interesting to see. This is the first time I think ever at a pro event in doubles where the 4 number 1 seeds all won their bracket. So kind of an interesting weekend where we didn't have that doubles team come out of nowhere and win their bracket. Quite interesting. All right. So, like I do normal is I fly through this stuff. I talk the whole time, but any questions you guys have you want to throw out there? I want to do more of a session where everyone can talk and not just kind of type ideas to me. So I'd like to set one up kind of with directors as we get into June, talk about CPI and where that goes forward as well through conversation. Through like a think tank session where we can get together and chat. But if you have anything you want to throw out there right now, whether it's a question or a suggestion I could take notes on, that would be cool. Try to fly up the list here, but the roller on my mouse is broken. So I can get up to the top. Kind of looking at this average skill number today. Yep, I know this one, you brought up many times. It's a known thing that we want directors, players or not, to have access to all the data. So, yep, thanks for bringing that one up. CPI seating, yep, that's actually one I left off the list. We've definitely talked about how that might be interesting. Now, with CPI being a pretty accurate tool onto a player skill level, seeding by CPI becomes a little bit dangerous just because that top seed would be predicted to win majority of the time. And so, when it comes to ACL points and seeding, now you might have points from attending events or playing well at a couple events to get you a higher seed, but that doesn't mean you're necessarily going to win that bracket. Now, what we're seeing with CPI is it does actually have a strong leaning towards the highest CPI winning that bracket. So, might put ourselves in a bad spot if it's CPI seeding and you're going into this saying, hey, I don't have a shot, I'm the bottom seed based on CPI and I've never beat Jamie Graham, probably never will beat Jamie Graham, so that there is interesting and maybe a tool we can provide, but I'm not sure at what level it would be fair. Yep, and kind of pointing towards Kevin there's maybe where my head was going with that too, is using that CPI as a predictive tool, but not necessarily say you're the number one seed because you have the highest CPI. That's almost just placing you top to bottom simply based on skill and not necessarily the outliers, right? If you went to a regional and you won a bracket as an outlier, your CPI is not going to be affected a whole lot, but your points would, and so those points actually come into play for seeding based on you earning those. But curious to see where that goes. Yep, and then coming back saying, I think it's more accurate seeding than points. Yeah, it may really be more accurate in predicting where you're going to finish, but still, depending on how your CPI numbers met, I'm not sure that just placing the highest CPI at the top seed is the best thing right now, but something to look at. Okay, moving forward, stamp boards for next season. Well, we don't have a stamp boards rule going into next season. That's actually the season after. So next season is the 2025-26 season. The stamp board rule goes into effect in the 26-27 season. Talking about smaller clubs that can't purchase large amounts of boards, how we're going to handle that. And you mentioned local points events. Well, local events won't have a stamped rule. There is no stamp board rule for local events. In the 26-27 season, there will be stamp board required for regional events and higher, but not for local events. Talking with a lot of board manufacturers, I know that there's been a lot of deals offered out there. A lot of directors have got deals and sponsorship deals through these stamp manufacturers, and maybe got some sets for free or for using a logo and these type of things. So we're definitely trying to get licensees to work with our directors first, and that's a priority for us. Right. Dennis says CPI seems to be leveling in the field, which might help attendance, and I do agree with that. I think right now, just looking at open and advanced and feeling worried about where you fit, CPI being more of a true metric to who you are might actually allow you to play people at your level that you should be playing, instead of signing up for competitive and losing to someone that maybe actually should be advanced, but they haven't moved up yet. And I think playing with someone with similar CPI will actually create some very competitive games. Yeah, so Dennis, we have talks about attendance every single week. Some directors around the country are doing things on their own to build that. And technology is the biggest driver for us right now as we look forward into what we believe will help increase attendance, creating incentives for players, at the national level, but then providing directors with tools to create incentives on their own to keeping players playing that really don't have to do with money or points or CPI for that matter. But yeah, players' attendance, it's really a topic that we talk about a lot. Next one, Daryl currently says you need 2 years of date to create a player's CPI. So you don't need 2 years worth. You actually need 50 games played. it will keep 2 years worth tallying into your CPI, but you don't have to have that to get a CPI. You just current form, you have to have 50 matches played to have a true CPI number. But we're talking about ways on how new players can get a CPI starting on day one. That number does build in the background, so there's something there we can work with. We just want to make sure that it's accurate and usable. But you don't need 2 years of data to have one. It's just keeping 2 years of data up to date. So, if you played 50 games, 50 matches, and your CPI becomes live on the player app, that will be a number that would fluctuate probably a little bit quicker than something using 2 years of data. But it will help determine who you really are over time. Now, going into next season, or each season, you're going to drop off 2 seasons ago. So maybe maybe 2 years ago you were brand new, and so that's kind of brought your CPI down for the last 2 years in some sense. So then going into the next season, 2 years old will drop off, your CPI will go up, which will probably be a lot more accurate to where you are at that time versus where you were or how you've been building over that last 2 years. And another comment on the bug fix here. There's people on the list that don't have a CPI yet. We've fixed a lot of those. A lot of players that did not have a CPI have one, and we work through those fixes still. Yep. Like I said in that previous slide, we've added a couple thousand players to CPI just in the last couple months. So players are earning CPI that didn't have one before. And Daryl just clarifying on 50 games. Yes, actually on the website, Daryl, we have iplaycornhole.com/CPI, and it gives you a very specific breakdown on not only the 50 games, but just kind of what's all entailed with that in total. And yep, oops. And yep, no problem. And any of those that continue to stand out, let me know. That's an evolving list that's being worked through. Bam. All right. Flew through a bunch of good comments. I like that. I like having people engaged. It's always fun. Been on here for 38 minutes. That's pretty good. Pretty good. I think kind of fly through some data here. My roller will let me go up. This is the one that I kind of like to see, which I want to share again, building up to 25,000 players now with CPI. So number keeps growing every time we look at it. Players are hitting that number. So yeah, I'll leave you with that. And thank you guys for joining. Look forward to having some think tank sessions or focus groups around CPI and around just the future of local and regional events. Thanks.